Dear Lord, please bless us and enlighten us as we continue our studies this afternoon. May our faith be increased and our hearts drawn closer to you. Please bless us now. In Jesus' name, amen.
So she needs to read.
Okay, so we had a session this morning already. And I just wanted to make a correction. I made a mistake. And it's here with the 5 years. I'm sure probably many of you noticed that this doesn't add up. And I took that from the French Revolution accidentally. So it's a symbolic midway. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. I've removed the 5s that were there before. So if you notice that, it was just a slip up. Another point that was made to me this afternoon. The judgment of the living. There's also an executive judgment that happens later on as well. So you could see it as 3 parts in some ways as well. But between 9/11 and close of probation, there's 2. And now we can proceed with to this next study. I just wanted to just run us through again what we did before. So we looked at the period from 2001 to close of probation in particular. And I talked about how it can be one story, but also be seen as having 2 parts. We have other stories that maybe start earlier and finish later. But when it comes to things like the lifetime of the plant, that's the bit I'm focused on for this study. So we looked at the period of rain, of wheat, angels, the 2nd and 3rd angels, and how they're structured. And for this presentation, I want to choose one of those. And what I want to focus on is the 2nd angel's message. So just to remind us of the 2nd angel's message, I'll read Revelation 14:8. And there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because it made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of its fornication. In Revelation 18, we see this message is empowered. In Revelation 18, we see this message is empowered. So I'll read Revelation 18:1 and 2. And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with its glory. The second verse. And it cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. So as I've said, the second angel's message begins at 2001 and finishes at close of probation. And the empowerment is in the middle at Sunday Law. Now I want to talk about the three angels' messages in the chapters of Daniel. Okay, we have been taught in the past that the third angel's messages can be lined up with certain chapters in Daniel. The first angel's message is to fear God, give God glory, for the hour of judgment is come. Looking at Daniel chapter 1 and 4, we can see how this fits with the stories. In chapter 1, Daniel and his friends fear God more than the king. They give glory to God by being faithful. And then they're judged to be 10 times better than the other wise men. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar goes through an experience. Where he didn't fear God or give God glory, and then experienced judgment. The second angel's message is that Babylon is fallen, is fallen. And if we look at Daniel 2 and 5, we can see how this fits. Yep. Both stories are to do with the fall of Babylon. And we will look at this in more detail. The third angel's message has been lined up with Daniel 3 and 6. Because in both stories we see an unrighteous decree. There's a decree to bow to the image in Daniel 3. And there's a decree to pray to Darius in Daniel 6. These chapters are connected to our reform line. Because they're related to the angel's messages. And each chapter tells a story. Each story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I wanted to analyse chapters 2 and 5, which relate to the second angel's message, and understand how they might be placed on our reform line. In this presentation, I want to walk you through the results of how I have lined up these two stories. How I lined them up with each other, and how I lined them up with our reform line. I will be sticking to the literal story. I won't be interpreting what the symbols mean in application. My hope is that by sharing this, the movement can consider if I have lined up the stories correctly. If acceptable, then those that are good at making application might use it. So because the second angel's message begins at 2001, we will start our story at 2001, which is a Boston. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 1, we can see that Nebuchadnezzar receives a hidden message from God. Verse 1 says, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him. I hope what I've just drawn makes sense to everybody. We spoke about this morning. This repeating pattern of Boston, Concord and Exeter test. So for Daniel 2, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar receives a hidden message from God. And in Daniel 5 at the beginning, Belshazzar receives a visit from the invisible divine watcher. So I'll read Daniel 5 verses 1 to 4. I'll read all 4 verses and then the translators can do theirs. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of his house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. There's a quote from Prophets and Kings as well. Gives us a little bit more information. I might read little bits so that translators can do it without having to look it up. The reference is Prophets and Kings 524.1. Little did Belshazzar think that there was a heavenly witness to his idolatrous revelry. That a divine watcher, unrecognised, looked upon the scene. Of profanation. Heard the sacrilegious mirth, beheld the idolatry. So in both stories, something arrives. A message or a messenger. And it's invisible. It's an unsealing. For both stories, this is the initiation of something that will escalate to a climax. So I think this fits with the Boston. The next waymark I want to look at is 2019. And in the chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar gets suspicious of the wise men and he formulates a plan to kill them. I'll read Daniel 2 verses 8 and 9. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar gets suspicious and forms a plan. In chapter 5, Belshazzar can now see the hand of the messenger and the message, but he can't interpret it. I'll read chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. So Belshazzar can see the hand and the message, but he can't interpret it. He can't fully understand it. So when we look at Concord and its characteristics, this seems to fit. Nebuchadnezzar has an increase of knowledge about the trickery of the wise men. He's starting to plan what he will do to them, but it isn't formalised as an official decree yet. For Belshazzar, he's having an increase of knowledge that there is a divine message for him, but he can't understand it fully. In both stories, each of the king's anxiety is increasing as they're becoming more desperate for an interpreter. The divine watcher was invisible before. And now we can see the hand. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin is written there, but it's not comprehensible. So I think this fits with Concord. The next waymark is 2021. And that's an Exeter. And in the story, Nebuchadnezzar promises to kill the wise men if the dream is not explained. I'll read Daniel 2, verses 12 and 13. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. And I want to also skip some verses and read verse 16. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. So Daniel successfully gets a pause on the decree. So even though it's been given and explained, it's not going to be put into effect for a certain period of time. So I've just popped down the verses there on the board for everyone. And for chapter 5, it's verses 7 to 12. And I'll just read verse 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. All right. So in chapter 5, those verses, you see Belshazzar promises to reward Daniel. If the message is explained. Chapter 2 is a threat of what happens if you don't. And chapter 5 is a promised reward if you do. So I think they line up well together. So in terms of Exeter characteristics, Nebuchadnezzar makes a command to destroy, which we know is going to happen, but not yet. Daniel is given time, and time setting is a feature of Exeter. There's a loud cry by Belshazzar, which is a symbol we see at Exeter sometimes. We can see an increase of distress in Belshazzar. Back in verse 5 at Concord, it said he was troubled. But now in verse 9 it says he's greatly troubled. And in both of the stories we see Daniel is contrasted with the other wise men. So you can see two groups. The next waymark I want to look at is Sunday Law waymark. Daniel 2 is going to say that Daniel understands the dream and is able to interpret. I'm going to read chapter 2, verses 19 to 21. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God for ever and ever, for wisdom and might are theirs. And God changeth the time and the seasons. God removeth kings and setteth up kings. God giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. Chapter 5. Actually, first, I want to read a quote from Prophets and Kings about chapter 2. Their faith was strong in the consciousness that God had placed them where they were. That they were doing God's work and meeting the demands of duty. In this, their time of special need. You can find that reference in Prophets and Kings 493.3. It shows that it was a time of testing and time of special need. Chapter 5 aligns with this. Daniel understands the message that was on the wall and is able to interpret. I'll read verses 15 to 17. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. So both passages align almost exactly here. In both cases, when we get to the middle of the chapter, we see that Daniel can give the interpretation where others cannot. For Daniel, this is a climactic moment. It's where the test comes to the crunch. Especially in chapter 2, you can see that there is suspense. Is he a true prophet or not? And now everybody knows, yes, he is. So that's the end of part 1 of our story. And now we're at the midway point. And as I said, that this waymark is a bit unique. It's the end of something, but it's also the beginning of something. And it's also midway, where it's the turning point. I think that part 1 of this story seems to be in chapter 5 and chapter 2 and chapter 5, both of them. Whether or not Daniel will be able to interpret this dream or message. So it answers the question, who can interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream? Who can interpret the writing on the wall? And also, who can't? Remember, I'm only taking the literal story, and it's possible there are other themes. As we've been learning about Daniel chapter 3, it seems there are different ways to look at a story. But when I compared the two stories, this is what I saw as very similar. So what's part 2 about? It seems to be about what actually is the interpretation. What is God saying to Nebuchadnezzar? What is God saying to Belshazzar, to Babylon? It's also, as I said, a turning point in the story. Everything that follows is the outcome of this moment when Daniel receives the interpretation. We'll see that the power balance shifts between the king and Daniel. And we'll look at that a bit more tomorrow. My next step is to consider this same part of the story as a beginning. The beginning of part 2 instead of the end of part 1. In other words, we will look at the Boston characteristics. Hidden things that are tucked into the event we just described. In the parable of the wheat, we saw that a new seed is planted inside the flour. So what new seed was planted in the middle of Daniel 2 and Daniel 5? We've already read the verses. We haven't read every single verse, but we read the key ones. So we don't need to read them again. But the point for me is that it's not who can do it. We see that the interpretation has arrived. A message has arrived into Daniel's mind. And no one can see it yet. Certainly the king can't see it yet. So in verse 19, it says that Daniel received the revelation of the secret. In verses 20 to 21, where he blesses God, he blesses God for being the one who removes and sets up kings. This indicates he has the message in his mind, although he hasn't said it to people yet. In chapter 5, it's very similar. So he receives the interpretation. In verse 17, Daniel knows it's a message of doom, and he says, "Let thy gifts be to thyself and give thy rewards to another." He hasn't told us what the message is yet, but you can tell he knows. In Prophets and Kings, it puts it this way. Before that terror-stricken throng, Daniel, unmoved by the promises of the king, stood in the quiet dignity of a servant of the Most High. Not to speak words of flattery, but to interpret a message of doom. That's Prophets and Kings 529.1. So in terms of a Boston, there's an unsealing of the interpretation at this waymark. As I said, it's invisible at the moment because it's in Daniel's mind and he hasn't explained it yet. Daniel knows Babylon is going to fall. He also knows why. But so far from the king's perspective, the interpretation has arrived, but it's invisible to him. The next waymark is the waymark that comes after Sunday law. So I'll call it increase of knowledge after Sunday law. Because I don't know the date or when it is. So in chapter 2, the story continues. Daniel says what the dream was without the interpretation. And he does explain why it was given. I'm going to read verses 28 to 31. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed. What should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have, more than any living, but for their sakes, that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. In chapter 5, it's really similar. Daniel tells the king what the writing says without the interpretation and explains why it was given. I'm going to read verses 22 to 25. So it starts off with him reminding him about Nebuchadnezzar. And continues with, "And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines, have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood and stone, which see thee not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was that the part of the hand sent from God, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin." So, in terms of it being a concord, in both of the stories, the kings are getting an increase of knowledge about what the dream or the message says. All they get at the moment is the symbols, not the interpretation. And in both cases, they're told the reason. The reason why God is telling them something. Both kings had been glorying in their greatness. And the greatness of Babylon. The next waymark is the loud cry. And that's an Exeter. In chapter 2, Daniel gives the interpretation of the dream. Babylon will fall. I'll read chapter 2, verse 39. "And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth." And I'll skip some verses and go to verse 44. "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all of these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." So there's an end to the gold part of the statue. So we can see Babylon will fall. And then we can see the entire statue will fall as well at the verse 44. As we understand, it's all Babylon. So that's the interpretation. In chapter 5, it's similar. Daniel gives the interpretation of Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin. Babylon will fall. I'll read chapter 5, verse 26. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. I'll read verses 27 and 28 as well. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. From Prophets and Kings, it uses the word fall. Belshazzar was to fall, and his kingdom was to pass into other hands. That's page 530, paragraph 3. So in terms of an Exeter, we can see how closely these chapters parallel each other. In both of the stories, Daniel is giving the interpretation to the king. These messages from God are a formal declaration of what is to come, like a decree. Numbered thy kingdom, which is like time has run out for Babylon. We also see what we know as the 2520 here. We understand that Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin can give us a 2520. Throughout this whole story, there's an increase of knowledge about the Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin symbol. But it's at this waymark where Daniel explains that it has something to do with time. Daniel didn't add up the currency values to get 2520 like we do. But the message for Babylon is that time is run out. So I'll just add that to our board. It's really the same for both stories. The close of probation waymark. Chapter 2. Daniel is rewarded and Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face. I'll read verses 46 to 48. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odours unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Okay. So, chapter 5, it's similar. Daniel is rewarded, Belshazzar falls, and Babylon falls. I'll read verses 29 to 31. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. There's a quote from Prophets and Kings for this as well. The army of Cyrus now stood under the walls of the palace. The city was filled with the soldiers of the enemy, as with caterpillars. That's from page 531, paragraph 2. And there's another quote from the next page, 532, paragraph 1. Clearly had the Hebrew prophets spoken concerning the manner in which Babylon should fall. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. So, in terms of shut door characteristics, we can see that there's two outcomes. Daniel is rewarded, and it's contrasted with the fall of Babylon itself. The prediction that Babylon's time is up is fulfilled here. Also, we see the arrival of Cyrus, who's a type of Christ. And we understand that Christ receives the kingdom at close of probation. So that aligns well. We have an executive judgment coming upon Babylon at close of probation. In Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face to worship Daniel. Doesn't mean he literally died or anything. But the king can represent the kingdom. And so I think it can be taken symbolically. And in chapter 5, Babylon falls in two different ways. Belshazzar represents the kingdom because the king is a kingdom. He dies. And we know Babylon comes to an end when Medo-Persia takes over. So I've come to the end of chapters 2 and 5. I have tried to line them up with our waymarks. It seemed to me to fit within that time period where the second angel's message also fits. I've described how it's a turning point in the middle. You can see it's all one story from beginning to end. But I'm suggesting that there's two sub-stories within that. And that's the end of my presentation. We have a little bit more time. So I can offer opportunity if anybody has any questions. Or if anybody disagrees with anything. You raise your hand if you want to say anything. Yes. Over there. Do we have a microphone?
You mentioned that during the interpretation of Daniel of the writing on the wall, Daniel didn't know how to interpret it in the way that we do. Of coming up with the number 2520. So I'm interested in how Daniel did it in interpreting that writing on the wall.
Thank you for your question. I think, yep, I really don't know exactly how he did it. I imagine that he would have known a lot of prophecies just like we understand and have studied prophecy. So he's a diligent student of prophecy. I think that would be part of it. He's also going through the words and looking at the meanings of the words. Perez means divided because the value was half of the other currency. I think Perez. Which one was it? Yeah, Perez is divided. So he may have used the meanings of the words and plus what he already knew from the scriptures and the prophecies. Or God inspired him in a special way, like we saw in another chapter. But I'm not sure the number 2520 would have meant much to Daniel. So that's my assumption, that he didn't do it that way. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Elder Gracious.
Okay, I actually wanted to ask for a summary.
Okay.
I just want to find out if I've understood well. Yeah, it's a summary.
Just of today's presentation?
Able to combine both, it's still fine, but today was the major.
All day? Or just this one?
Oh. This one
Just
is
this one.
okay, but
Okay.
I was saying if you are able to start from, if time allows for you to start from the first one coming down, but if it doesn't allow, you can do this one.
I'm not sure how much time is left. We've got time, I think. So this morning, in the first presentation, I wanted to prepare us for this one. Mainly to focus our attention from 2001 to close of probation. Because I understand that the second angel's message begins at 2001 and finishes at close of probation. And that understanding I've taken from other presentations that have been done in the movement. To put the story on a line, we need to know where it should start and where it should end. And if we want to take that chapter and put it on a line, we can look through the story and see things that ring a bell, sound familiar. There was something in the story where someone cried aloud. I aimed to use little things like that to try to locate where it should sit. So that was what I was setting us up for in the first one. And then I also wanted to show that with that portion of our line, there are two sections. So that when we look at Daniel, we'll be able to see if there are two sub-stories in that as well. If we're going to find a Boston in the middle of the story somewhere, then it would imply that there's something else like escalating for the second half of the story. So presentation one was really about reminding us of the tools that we have, and some examples of how they've been used before. so that when we come to this chapter, we can see we're doing something similar again. Boston, Concord and Exeter are things that there's a lot of things we could look for at a particular waymark. But I wanted to remind us that at every waymark we might not see every single thing. In this story at the Concord waymark, we don't have to see a death decree every single time. As an example. Because in Samuel Snow's story, we don't see that either. So these were some of the things I wanted to put in place in preparation for the second study. When I studied this myself at home, I actually started from the end of the chapter and worked backwards. But it makes more sense for you if I present it going forwards. But even going backwards, it just seemed to me quite possible to identify where certain things should sit to me. And working backwards, I ended up at 2001 without trying to force it that way. So I think the job is for you to decide whether you think I've made mistakes, whether there are two different dispensations but they should be shifted somewhere else on our line, whether we should break it up into a lot more pieces and spread it out further. So I think the job is for you to decide whether you think I've made mistakes, whether there are two different dispensations but they should be shifted somewhere else on our line, whether we should break it up into a lot more pieces and spread it out further, or whether we shouldn't do this at all. So I put this to you, I guess, for your consideration. If it's correct, people that perhaps Sunday law messengers or others that are better able at making application than me, perhaps some of you will consider it. If it is correct, you can take those sections of the chapters and then see, would it make sense? What would be the application in 2019 for that? What would that mean? Or at Sunday law, who is Daniel? Who knows who has that understanding? All of that. Because for me, things seem to be a lot more complicated than I used to think. So I'm not brave to try doing that myself. Is that okay? Okay. I think that takes us to the end of our time. But I welcome people to contact me with their thoughts and questions if they like. So let's close in prayer. Our wonderful God, we want to give you our thanks and our praise. Because your word is beautiful. And we just love so much all that you have put in place for us. We ask for an increase in our faith. And we know you have been guiding us and will continue to guide us. As this movement, as a line of success, will continue through. And we look forward to the new kingdom. May this give us hope that there will be an end to these troubles. And remind us of how close we are. So that we don't lose heart and get tired. Thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name, amen.